Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome very much to this side event on the issue and impunity for war crimes. Today we are talking about, this year we have the 15th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. It was an illegal war in a blatant violation of the United Nations Charter. It was a war of aggression without the permission of the Security Council. This year marks the 15th anniversary of the invasion. And sometimes this seems to be forgotten by the international community. The occasion of the 15th anniversary of the illegal invasion should be the occasion to remember that the consequences of the war, because if the United Nations Charter is violated, it has ramifications until today. As all of you know, there was a significant opposition to the war in 2003, and we have one panelist with us that will speak about the opposition against the illegal war that was around the world and against the coalition of the willing. We have another speaker who will talk about his experience as a journalist in Iraq. And then this panel will be followed by another panel in which we will discuss the result of the invasion and also the legal consequences and the question, we will address the question of accountability. This event is broadcasted live on Al Jazeera Live. So thank you very much to Al Jazeera. And you find translation. So on channel 2, you have the English version, and on channel 3, you have the Arabic translation. As a first speaker, I'd like to introduce Jan Lönn. He is the chair of the Swedish Network Against the War and Secretary General of the International Youth and Student Movement for the United Nations. His advocacy work includes campaigning for accountability and justice for Iraq. He has been very active in Sweden against the war, so ahead of the war, and he will talk about the opposition against the illegal invasion. Thank you very much, Jan Lönn, for being here with us, and you have the floor. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be invited to this important side event to reinforce our support for the principles of the United Nations Charter to bring justice to the victimized people of Iraq and to recall, remember, and take as a stepping point for further action the great movements we had in 2002 and 2003 to stop the war that was planned by the United States at that time, a war with disastrous consequences we are clearly witnessing today. I was the chair of the Swedish Network Against War for a short time of 2 years, because this was the network that we set up in September 2002 in order to follow together with this great movement that was building up internationally to stop the war that was planned by President Bush and which he had declared was going to be one of his priorities for his term of office. So that is my background in this work. Of course, we all remember how the people of Iraq was under the most draconic sanctions for a 10-year period. And after that, they became the victim of the occupation with its enormous consequences for the entire society in Iraq. We started at a global level the campaign in the autumn of 2002 to mobilize against the war plans. And at a meeting of the European Social Forum in October 2002, there was issued an appeal to the global public to organize protests against the war. And it stated in its anti-war call, "We believe this war, whether it has UN backing or not, will be a catastrophe for the people of Iraq, already suffering because of the embargo and the Saddam Hussein regime, and for people across the Middle East. It should be opposed by everyone who believes in democratic political solutions to international conflicts, because it will be a war with potential to lead to a global disaster." And the decision and agreement was to plan for a major global mass manifestation and demonstrations on the 15th of February 2003, and also to plan in case the war would be launched by the United States to have immediate actions and demonstrations on the next Saturday. What happened was that we had, in most countries of the world, I think, and in particular in the European countries, North America, and other similar countries, that people started to organize. There were different types of organizers who came together. Some came together from the peace movement, others with background in leftist forces. That was the kind of movement that was built up. But it came to include, finally, a broad cross-section of all sorts of peoples, from religious organizations, from political parties, from trade unions, from members of parliament. Of course, the movement in Britain and the United States was particularly strong. In Britain, it was a movement which included, for example, the present leader of the Labour Party, who opposed that policy of Tony Blair, the Prime Minister at that time, for supporting the Bush war. It was a movement that existed in the West European countries with a strength that was built up. I was the chair of this Swedish network that was built up from September 2002, and we took a decision that the fight against war and for peace, that is a duty and obligation and a right for everyone to participate in. So this was our decision, that we had to bring together everyone who stood up for the UN principles to oppose this war. And having that clear non-sectarian principle from the beginning made it possible to bring together the broadest alliance ever in Sweden against an aggressive war, irrespective of the fact that the Swedish government did not take a clear stand against it at that time. So when the 15th of February came in Stockholm, we had 150,000 people coming together at the time of the preparations for this war. We had as speakers from political parties, from the wide angle of political parties, from religious actors, from the broadest cross-section we have ever seen at a manifestation of this type, and we marched to the US Embassy. When the war started on the 20th of March 2003, we had better preparations in terms of convincing the government to oppose this war strongly and without hesitation. So at that manifestation we held on the Saturday after that the war had been launched. We had also the cabinet minister for development cooperation as one of the speakers who launched the call that we must stop the war that had been launched. And the demonstration proceeded to the US embassy. So we had like in the many countries, like in London, where more than 1 million people were marching, we had this very strong manifestation. But unfortunately, our call was not listened to globally and internationally. It is true that we succeeded to prevent many countries from joining the US coalition. I think that is a clear result of the protests, and also that it helped to reinforce the determination of several members of the Security Council to refuse any form of agreement with the invasion, and that was important at that time. So we had millions of people coming together in the greatest peace manifestation ever in the history of humanity. In my country, in Sweden, when the war was launched, the schools in Stockholm went on strike. The students and pupils had prepared a school strike to protest against the war, and they assembled at the main square in Stockholm. It was this sort of popular sentiment against the war in so many countries at that time. But as I said, unfortunately, our calls for the United Nations General Assembly to meet and oppose the war did not happen. And here in the United Nations in Geneva, the Commission on Human Rights was meeting at the same time. And the calls for having a special sitting to discuss the war that had been initiated was refused at that time, was unwisely refused. So we did have a very weak reaction after the launching of the war, and which of course is also responsible for what happened after that. The international community started rather to see how they could be involved in some way to make the occupation less brutal, and that was also the policy that was agreed in the United Nations Security Council afterwards, so that the UN in fact became involved together with the occupation rather than to oppose it, rather than to establish the principles that we have had when the UN has been involved in ending occupations, organizing referendums, election, bringing people together. It became rather an unfortunate part of the occupation, but not entirely, of course, because there were also important efforts made to report on the human rights violations in Iraq from the experts in the UN mission in Iraq, although there was no official way to bring those reports into the United Nations human rights system at that time. And still there is no such avenue because there is no special rapporteur on human rights in Iraq, etc. There was a special rapporteur on human rights in Iraq that was to report on the violations of the previous regime. But in 2003, the Human Rights Commission decided that that special rapporteur should end reporting on the existing situation on Iraq. He should only be allowed to report on the human rights situation before the invasion of Iraq. And my organization, the ISMUN, made a very strong statement when this came to the Economic and Social Council to be reaffirmed in July 2003, where we expressed our concern over the new mandate for this special rapporteur on human rights in Iraq, submitted by the Commission on Human Rights, The special rapporteur is practically requested to turn a blind eye and ignore the present human rights situation in Iraq resulting from war and occupation, and instead only concentrate on past violations by the former regime in Iraq. So this was how the whole problematic was built up, of a failure to take a strong stand on the human rights violations in Iraq during the time of the occupation. And now, of course, we all know what are the consequences of this, the tremendous destruction of Iraq in every way, the loss of life of people, and the emergence of forces in Iraq, like the Islamic State and others, who has never been seen or contemplated before, and who are reaching out with their violence to many corners of the world. This could have been better if the world had reacted more strongly against the violations in Iraq. And I would like to end with recalling that when the invasion of Iraq was launched in 2003, it was just shortly after that the International Criminal Court Charter had been adopted, which contained in its register of crimes the launch of an illegal war of aggression. Now, that element of crime has not been activated until now. It was activated on the 15th of December last year by the Conference of the Parties to the International Criminal Court. And now it is up for ratification by the member states of the International Criminal Court. 37 states have ratified it up to now. And I do think it would send a clear message that we will not tolerate any new wars of aggression if we urge countries and states to ratify this part of the statutes of the International Criminal Court. It would send a warning to some of those countries who agreed to be part of the coalition back in 2003, that they should not be part of such adventures anymore in the future. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan Leun, for your presentation, in which you speak about the opposition against the war. Of course, the war on Iraq is a clear failure of the United Nations to stop an aggression. You spoke about a coalition against the war that was very strong. As we all know, despite this opposition, there was the coalition of the willing that was determined under a pretext to invade Iraq, and nothing could have stopped them. And unfortunately, as you mentioned the International Criminal Court, and I would like to remind everybody that a war of aggression is considered as the supreme crime that contains within itself the accumulated evil as a whole. So, of course, we should now learn from this and end all forms of aggression. However, we also need to call for accountability for what has happened in 2003. And I'm very honored to have with us as a next speaker the very well-known journalist and policy analyst Ahmad Qureshi, who has been a journalist and has been in Iraq during the time of the war. And he will tell us about what he has witnessed on the ground in Iraq and what really happened. So I'm very honored to have him here with us. And Ahmad Qureshi, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me. I'll mix the personal with the professional. I leave the analysis for other more able speakers here about what happened during the war in Iraq. I'll cover the period from the weeks just before the war started and the first, let's say, 8 months after the occupation of Iraq. And of course I'll be mixing the personal with the professional because I'll just tell you what I saw because I had the opportunity to be embedded with one of the U.S. Army units that first crossed into Iraq on the 20th of March 2003 and then had the opportunity to spend some time with a British unit that actually was involved in the siege of the second largest Iraqi city, Basra. For about 3 weeks the siege went on. But before the invasion started, I would like to tell you about a hotel in the south of Kuwait where the teams that were assembled by Paul Bremer, the viceroy of Iraq, who came to be known as the viceroy. He was the head of the coalition, the provisional authority that ruled Iraq after the occupation, where he was based, and the type of team he assembled, and exactly what type of people were roaming around in that hotel, and what were the plans that they were planning for Iraq. But before, and I will just. I've put together some slides. This is a big story, of course. I'm supposed to cover this in 10 minutes, so I'll just go very quickly through a slide of pictures, and along with the pictures, I will tell you the story very quickly. But before I do that, I just would like to tell you, Mr. Lon, you mentioned the efforts that were being done by you and the coalition and the groups and the activists who were involved. Usually it is said journalists like me profit, we too profit from the war because, you know, we get to cover and we get to take huge amounts of money from our news organizations, and it's an opportunity for us to really, you know, show our skills and sort of attract viewership. So, but at the same time, you have journalists who also work on principle, and I was lucky to be with a group of journalists while you were in the weeks before 15th of Feb. While you were working on the protests, we had a group of journalists in the region and outside the region working in a different route. We were trying to reach out to elements within the Bush administration that were probably not predisposed toward war. And what happened is that through an American friend, I and a group of journalists, we sent a very good proposal, a very strong one, to start a program in the media that inside the United States that would help, maybe would help in stopping the march toward war. This was December 2002, about 4 months before the war began. And through a friend, we managed to reach to Secretary of State Colin Powell. And we submitted the proposal to him. He was gracious enough to look into it. He found a ray of hope in it. He responded back, and we had a meeting in the region in Islamabad, in Pakistan, with Ambassador Nancy Powell. No relation to Secretary Powell. It was a good meeting with a group of journalists, and we were hoping to launch a program in the US media, backed by the State Department, that would basically talk about, you know, Arabs and Muslims and Americans and how they can coexist and how we should stop extremists in our region and in the US from marching toward war. And unfortunately, of course, we failed in that. Secretary Powell was gracious enough to move on with that, but the march to war was stronger than any of us, and it continued. So I'll just move on, if we move to the next slide. Basically, I would like to tell you first one thing. The preparation for the war, for the invasion of Iraq in 2003, okay, for 2000, thank you. For 2003, the invasion happened in 2003, but actually the preparation for the invasion began much earlier. Yes, there was a new Khan cabal. Yes, Bush, after the success in Afghanistan, wanted to move on to Iraq. But actually, I saw firsthand the preparation for the war start much earlier. The preparations began at least 6 or 7 years earlier. And I witnessed those firsthand. Many of the journalists did, who were based in 3 countries, mainly, primarily in Kuwait, but also in Bahrain and also in Saudi Arabia. Because it were these 3 countries that saw the amassing of American troops after the first Iraq War, which was I'm sure you remember, 1990, 1991, after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and the subsequent war, Desert Storm. So after Desert Storm, the whole infrastructure for the next war, remember, the war of 1991 was not finished. It was an unfinished business. Yes, Saddam Hussein was defeated. Our Iraqi army was expelled from Kuwait. But the business of containing Iraq was not stopped. And it continued from 1991 up until 2003. So the preparation for the invasion of Iraq, the eventual invasion and occupation of Iraq, began much earlier. And I'm just showing you this picture. I don't know if you go back, yeah. This picture, I mean, this is just one of many. I want to put you in the whole atmosphere, the environment. This picture is from 1994, and I tell you, for the entire decade of starting 1991 and up until 9/11, 2001, the desert of Kuwait, adjoining southern Iraq, was like this. The entire desert region of Kuwait was like this. We would move from one area of operations to another. They were training. They were doing mock attacks. They were doing they would create sample mini Iraqi villages, mini Iraqi neighborhoods. And I personally spent many days and weeks with different units of the U.S. Army, moving from between these different camps, and we would see the U.S. Army training, and we would discuss. The journalists, we would say, why is the U.S. Army mocking attacks on Iraqi villages and cities? And these were not attacks using aircraft, jets. No, these were storming into houses and streets, and we thought, wait a second, this is like invading Iraq, but the U.S. just defeated Iraq in 1991, and that's it. And there were sanctions on Iraq, no-fly zones, and that's it. And the U.S. government said we're not going in, and that's it. We wanted to free Kuwait, liberate Kuwait, and that's it. So the preparations began really 1994, 1995. The preparations for invading Iraq began at that time, really, and that was before Bush. This was during the time of President Bill Clinton. George Bush Sr., and then President Clinton. And it continued up until, of course, 2001. So this was really very fascinating. And, of course, next, please, thank you. I had the chance, of course, to interview with, lots of Kuwaiti, Bahraini, and Saudi military people. And they were actually ready from beginning 1993 and 1994. They knew that their territory would be used eventually to invade Iraq. They were mentally prepared. They were prepared in terms of infrastructure. They were prepared in terms of preparing their militaries, their intelligence. They were gathering information on Iraq, on southern Iraq, and contacting the Iraqi opposition groups. And this all started from 1994. So even though the U.S. government was saying that the war ended of 1991, and that's it, but we knew on the ground actually that the work has begun, really. Eventually, there will be an invasion of Iraq. At that time, of course, you have to understand the region was jubilant. This pamphlet was published by one of the largest newspapers in Kuwait City. It's called Al-Qabas. It's an important newspaper. Why? Because this newspaper was, for a long time, very influential in the Gulf region, in the Middle East. Kuwait had a semblance of freedoms, the media, as long as you don't touch the government. Long before Al Jazeera, of course, Jazeera was television, but this was print media. They allowed opposition, to some extent, opposition members from Iraq, from Syria, from other countries, from Egypt, to use the Kuwaiti media platform to air their dissenting views. So for Al-Qabas and Al-Qabas was publishing posters like this one and the next one. They were really very happy with what the United States did. They were, I mean, you would go to hotels, five-star hotels in Kuwait City, and you would find the pictures of the Emir of Kuwait with the U.S. President, both George Bush, Bill Clinton. I'm showing you this for a reason. The reason is that at that time, except for the U.S. government, everybody in the region really wanted the international community to move into Iraq. Everybody was excited. People were excited. People said, you know, the U.S. should not have stopped. So maybe the U.S. government did not want to invade Iraq, but I tell you, lots of people in the region wanted to actually move on, and we're pushing toward that. There were studies being made. There were intelligence being gathered and prepared and produced. So the work had started about 6 or 7 years earlier. Next, if we move. Next again, these are just a group of pictures. We've had, this picture is from USS Carl Vince and others. I'm just tornado units in Kuwait City in the desert. If we move next, yeah, next again, yeah. I want to stop here. I want to tell you about something very interesting. This is the Sheraton Hotel in Kuwait City. Just 1 year before the invasion of Iraq, and that was before 9/11, about 8 months before 9/11. An important meeting took place in this building. At the top floor, the entire floor was closed. Select people were invited. A group of from the National Security Council in Washington came down here at this hotel, and they invited key people from different Gulf countries, and from Jordan, and from Egypt. And all of them were gathered on the top floor of this hotel. I was also there. I got to see the deliberations. They were not for media. Basically, the National Security Council analysts from the United States were discussing with the people from security and political departments of the GCC countries, Jordan and Egypt, whether it would be better if we deal with Iraq in terms of an invasion sometime in the future and toppling Saddam Hussein, or whether we should remove just Saddam and work with one of his sons, maybe Uday or Qusay, and work with them. So, and of course, I think the Iraqi intelligence would have known about these movements because Kuwait was an important station for the Iraqi intelligence before Iraq invaded Kuwait during the Iran-Iraq War. So one of the first buildings the Iraqi army destroyed when it entered Kuwait City in 1990 was this building. If we move on next. Again, next. Yeah. Sheraton was one of the first buildings that was destroyed because they thought that this place was a place where conspiracies were being hatched much before 9/11. Were being hatched. The Western countries were meeting with local government representatives in the region, the GCC, Egypt, Jordan, and others, and planning and preparing for war against Iraq much before 9/11. So this meeting basically, and this was a very important meeting. The idea was whether the U.S. could work with the second son, I think the elder son of Saddam Hussein. Uday was more famous. Uday was more loud, well known. But everybody was actually, they were thinking Qusay would be, he was wise, he didn't speak much. He was violent, but wouldn't come to the open. So the idea was that the U.S. should work with Qusay. And many of the Gulf countries were actually advising the U.S., instead of going for an all-out war or invasion, they should actually work with Qusay. They should put some conditions on Saddam Hussein to step down or leave Iraq and then work with Qusay. Of course, eventually did not work out. And if we move on next, this is the family of Saddam Hussein. The next, of course, Qusay was killed along with his brother, and I think his son. This is one of the pictures. I'm not sure if it's verified, but it's one of the pictures that, after his killing in Iraq, after the invasion, of course. If we move on next, again, yeah, 0 hour, yeah. Before, I need to tell you one more thing. Before the actual invasion on 20th March, one of the things that I saw, very interesting, in Kuwait City, as I told you, Paul Bremer and the Coalition Provisional Authority, before the invasion, was stationed in Kuwait City in a hotel. you'd be surprised to know this was like the gold rush. If you've seen Hollywood films about America 200 years ago or 150 years ago, the gold rush, California and all these states, it was a gold rush all over again. You would have different American corporations. You'd have retired police officers from the US who would come and pitch to Paul Bremer and his deputy, Ryan Crocker, pitch to them ideas about how they could take a contract, for example, to rebuild the Iraqi police. And you'd have, for example, a group of retired American firefighters, an association of them or a consulting group who would pitch how they could, for example, recreate a firefighting brigade in Baghdad or in other Iraqi cities. It was, and of course you had oil companies, representatives from oil companies and others. It was amazing. It was a gold rush and it was surreal, frankly speaking. We thought, as journalists based in Kuwait City, watching Paul Bremer, who would be the first ruler of Iraq if the war succeeds and Saddam Hussein is removed, we thought we'd see military commanders, we'd see, I don't know, city planners, administrators, but that didn't happen, and all we saw was basically all these opportunists who wanted to benefit from war even before the war began. Much before the war actually began. I'm talking about January and Feb 2003. And the war began on 20th March. We moved, if we stay on this picture, we moved on 20th March. I was with the U.S., embedded with a U.S. Military unit. As you know, when you're embedded, you're supposed to cover certain things. You're not supposed to cover certain things. Frankly speaking, most of us were not sure the Americans would make it to Baghdad. We thought there would be tremendous resistance, and there's no way they'll make it. Many of us journalists were not comfortable, frankly, with the plans that they shared with us. They said, we will not stop anywhere. Even if we were engaged by small units of Iraqi army, we will ignore them. We will fire back, but ignore them. We will rush straight to Baghdad, and that's what we'll do. But somewhere at the start, the American unit met with the British unit, and I jumped ship with the British because the British planned to divert and go to Basra. We went to Basra. The British army got bogged down in Basra for 3 weeks. Meanwhile, the Americans went to Baghdad, and of course, you know, the 9th April bringing down of the statue, the Americans entered Baghdad, but the British army was bogged down for 3 weeks in Basra. What you're seeing here in this picture is actually during ceasefire talks with the Iraqi army. Of course, the conventional wisdom is that the Iraqi army was obliterated, was destroyed. This is not true. This is not true. We saw the Iraqi army firsthand in Basra hold ground for 3 weeks. They did not let the British army take over Basra. We are here at the front line with the British soldiers and their Iraqi and Kuwaiti translators. And at the back, you can see those are the positions of the Iraqi army fortified inside Basra. If not for the negotiations and the peaceful transfer by the surrendering Iraqi army units inside Basra, there was no way the coalition would have entered Basra for another probably 3 or 4 weeks. But meanwhile, the Americans, of course, managed to get into Baghdad. How did that happen? This is a very interesting story. If we move on next. I just want to show you these pictures of how most of us journalists really spend time in southern Iraq. I was based for about 6 to 8 months in southern Iraq. This is just outside the British military camp in Qasr, which is right next to Basra, and destroyed buildings during the bombing campaigns. And if we move on next, different journalists, this is how we spend time actually. Move on next. Yeah, I want to show you this thing. We found one of the good families of an Iraqi family really, somewhere in Basra in southern Iraq. And they gave us their house really to set up equipment, satellite equipment to send footage and so forth. This is a father who's on the ground, and that's the son who's sitting with me, and we were trying to get in touch with using satellite equipment. They told us something very interesting. They said we would not have, and this is an Iraqi Shia family in southern Iraq. They were influential. They said something very interesting. They said, you know, we would not have allowed the coalition forces to cross our territory all the way to Baghdad if we were not angry with our government. Had our anger been less than what it was, had our government been better to us, we would not have allowed anyone to invade our country. That was the version that I heard over there. And this is, we spent about 6 to 8 months in southern Iraq, but the real story was different. That was not the real story. The real story was very interesting. While we were in Kuwait, and Paul Bremer and the Coalition Provisional Authority and all the opportunists and the representatives of multinational companies were sitting and planning what they'll do and how they'll profit from Iraq after the war, what happened in southern Iraq is actually very interesting. What happened is that special forces, commanders and special forces and intelligence officers from the US and Britain actually collaborated on the ground with militias and groups that were in direct contact with the Iranian military, with the Revolutionary Guards. I have no evidence to support what I'm going to say next, but I dare to say that actually the British and the American commanders were in direct contact with Revolutionary Guards. They would, you know, fight each other diplomatically in the media, but in reality, on the ground, I think in secret meetings in southern Iraq, I have no doubt that Revolutionary Guard of Iran, the U.S. commandos or intelligence special operations officers and the British were all meeting and planning. And that was the only way the U.S. military and the British military could cross this region of southern Iraq and reach Baghdad. There was no way the U.S. military could have reached Baghdad in 3 weeks, starting 20th March, without direct coordination with the Iranian military. So this is a fascinating aspect of the war that many journalists besides me would tell you, but I'm surprised that very little has been written about this, very little. If we move on next, I don't want to take much time. If we go back, Tommy Franks, just very quickly, the Iraqi invasion was not without trouble. There was lots of trouble, just like Trump right now and his Pentagon and the U.S. military, the CIA, the FBI. There were really serious troubles between the U.S. government and the U.S. military on the ground. Tommy Franks was removed from his position just a month after the war began. On 23rd May, he was removed from his position. Why? Because the U.S. government, President Bush wanted more forces inside Iraq. He was not ready. A lot of politics, but I will not get into that. What I want to get into really is the next one. Paul Bremer, on 22, 1 day before Tommy Franks was fired, 1 day before that, Paul Bremer issued his order number 2 as the de facto ruler of Iraq, which was to dissolve the armed forces of Iraq, an army that took about 60 years to build, and it was one of the most professional militaries in the region. It was a secular army. It was an army built on Western lines. It was not an extremist army. It was not an anti-Western army. It was an army made up of people who were educated along British military and American military lines. It was completely dissolved. Paul Bremer basically issued in a statement, he said, I'm just signing a paper because the army actually is dissolved. After so many air sorties and our attacks, the army doesn't exist. Everybody deserted their posts, so the army is not there. Let me just sign a paper and dissolve the army. You know what happened next? That was not true. We saw with our own eyes how soldiers from this army, from these disbanded units, descended down on the green zone in Baghdad, on the Coalition Provisional Authority offices, and they said, what's next? Some of us are retired. Some of us are receiving our paychecks as retired people, pensions. What are we going to do? And the funniest thing is, they were said, you know, go start a business. Buy a taxi, run a taxi. You know what these soldiers did? Many of them actually went and joined the resistance to the occupation. Many of them joined the resistance. And that was the reason why the Iraqi resistance was ferocious. It was not an easy resistance. And that was one of the key reasons. The disbanding of the professional army of Iraq was one of the key reasons why the U.S. struggled with the Iraqi resistance, and it was one of the, I would say, one of the indirect results of that decision was the indirect, maybe not directly, was the rise of ISIS. Because I'm sure many of the disgruntled Iraqi intelligence officers, special operations officers, and this is an army that is very, very well trained. It fought Iran for 8 years. It fought Israel, I think, in 2 or 3 wars. It defended Damascus in one of the wars when the Syrian government was quite sure that Israel would actually invade Syria. I think this was the war of 67 or 56 probably, would invade Syria and take Damascus. The Iraqi army actually defended Damascus. So it was a very professional army. Some of them definitely went into the resistance. Very quickly, I just want to conclude by, if we go Ryan Crocker. Ryan Crocker is a very professional, amazing, impressive American diplomat. He was number 2 to Paul Bremer. He's an Arabist. He spoke very fluent Arabic. He was the American ambassador to Syria. But he was chosen to be the number 2 guy at the Provisional Coalition, Provisional Authority. Very good guy. He's also a friend. But I have his partial permission to say that both Paul Bremer and he recognize that the most serious mistake that the Americans did in Iraq was to disband the Iraqi army. If we move on next. I just want to conclude by 3 very quick, short videos, not more than 1 minute, very quickly. I would like to start by, should we really go into showing some of, I'll quit this first video. I wanted to show you really how the real Iraqi cities right now, this is a short video of 1 or 2 minutes, you should know how Iraqi cities are today. I mean, Iraq was one of those countries, we never knew. I mean, I had Iraqi friends since I was a kid in Kuwait, and I never knew that there were Yazidis in Iraq, and there were other, ethnic and religious groups, because Iraq was assimilated, was integrated. But what is Iraq today? This is a short video, hardly a couple of minutes, and this will give you really an idea of how bad the situation is in Iraqi cities between the various segments of the Iraqi population. This is what truly is the legacy of the American intervention in Iraq.
A good indication of the cinder block barrier here you see separates
Can you raise the voice?
Turkmen areas in this part of Tuzformatu here.
This is a city in Iraq.
From the mostly Kurdish areas, behind.
You have walls now in Iraqi cities dividing people that speak different languages.
The cinder block barrier was set up because car bombs were coming too often in the past, and so this was meant to block their progress towards the Shia-dominated Turkmen areas.
You have a second Kosovo or Bosnia in Iraq.
In this city is that these mostly. Another side of the tensions actually is that just now when we were here, I was here a second ago, and when they saw me filming, in fact, we had 2 of the local Hashid gunmen follow us and make sure that everything's okay. Because they said that in the past when we were filmed here, explosive canisters were planted a day later. It's a pretty tense area, I have to say.
It's a very interesting video. The purpose is just to show you these are the streets in Iraqi cities right now. They're divided, they're walls. Another, very quickly, that I would like to show you, another video is from Baghdad Airport, actually the last one, yeah. It's very interesting. This is a month ago, last month. The situation is so bad in Iraq right now that people are daring to stand in the middle of the Baghdad International Airport and say the situation was better under Saddam Hussein than it is right now. And this man was actually shouting in the middle of the airport saying, this is not how a country should run. This is complete waste. Why did we go to war? Saddam should not have been removed. And this was, this video I think was hardly 3 weeks ago, maybe or 4 weeks ago. No? people are generally laughing. You will not probably see much on this, but if you understand Arabic, that's it. If you understand Arabic, basically he's shouting, he's saying, you know, he's cursing the Iraqi government, he's cursing the administration, and he's saying basically that Saddam was better. I wanted to show you one more interesting video. Unfortunately, it's in Arabic, but I just a hint of what I wanted to show you. Kazim, the third one. This is the guy, the first guy, who took a hammer and destroyed the statue of Saddam Hussein on 9th April when the Americans entered Baghdad. This is the guy. He was interviewed by the BBC. Unfortunately, not in English, the BBC Arabic service. He used to work for the Iraqi government. Saddam Hussein executed 14 of his relatives. So when the Americans entered Baghdad on 9th April 2003, he rushed out, took a hammer, and jumped on the statue. He saw an American soldier putting an American flag. They'll show the clip right now. So he asked the American soldier to put an Iraqi flag. And then he went on destroying the statue. You can see the picture here. He was destroying the statue of Saddam Hussein using the hammer. The summary of this interview basically is he's saying now, 15 years later, if I could, I would go back and undo what I did. I would put the statue back. He is so desperate with what, you know, how Iraq had turned out. He's sorry. I mean, you can see his faces. I'm sure you can understand Arabic. Those of you who don't speak Arabic. But unfortunately, I tried to find this video in English as well. Saddam was a dictator. There's no doubt about this. But the fact of the matter is, Iraq today is worse. We should stop it. Iraq today is much worse than what it was before 19th March 2003 under Saddam Hussein. It's a very sad legacy. And I tell you, even while researching for this for this event, I could not find many of the things that we should really be talking about regarding this invasion. Not many books written about it. There's one book that was written, I think there's a last, if you could just move on quickly, this book by John Nixon, Debriefing the President. If you're interested in Iraq, you should read this book. John Nixon was the CIA guy who spent 20 years doing nothing. His job was to come in the morning to the office, make coffee, and study the movements of Saddam Hussein, how he used to talk, and, you know, analyze him. He wrote this book. It was redacted. If you buy this book, you'll open the book. I have a copy of it actually in my bag right now. If you open the book, many parts of it are redacted because, again, many things are yet to come out, really. So this is a sad story for Iraq from my perspective as a journalist, and thank you very much, Chair, for giving me some extra time. She gave me 10 minutes more, really. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ahmad, for this brilliant and still disturbing presentation. You clearly showed that the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was not something that was decided on the spot. It was long orchestrated and long before. And this is something we should bear in mind, that the reason that was given to invade Iraq, which is the weapons of mass destruction that were never found, was a pretext. That actually it was a long orchestrated plan, and it wasn't only the plan to invade Iraq, but also to undertake a full regime change under Bremer. You spoke about the dismissal of the army and about the disastrous consequences that result from that. And when we look at Iraq today, as you also said, it's much worse than before. So we have a system that has been shattered on all levels. We have a humanitarian and human rights crisis. We have a breakdown of public services, health services. We have shortages, deficits, ethnic tensions, sectarianism. All this results from the illegal action and the failure of the international community to prevent this crime. Now I would like to pass So now we have our second panel, and I would like to introduce Sabah Al-Mukhtar, who is the president of the Arab Lawyers Association in the UK and vice president of Geneva International Centre for Justice. He is a legal consultant in England on Arab affairs and Islamic law. He is an independent analyst with special knowledge of Iraq, UN-Iraq relations, economic policies, and risk analysis. He will give you an insight on the situation and everything that followed 2003 in Iraq. We are honored to have you here with us, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The date we are looking at is 20 March 2018 as opposed to 2003. 15 years ago, the illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq and the total destruction of that state by the United States of America and its allies reminds us that the UN itself has imposed a blockade on Iraq in 1990, and it permitted in 2003, the US invasion and subsequent occupation of a founding member of the United Nations. In 1945, one of the signatories on the Charter of the United Nations was Dr. Fadl al-Jamali, who was the Foreign Secretary of Iraq at that time. The US President W. Bush made his speech on mission accomplished at the time. But we have to remember that Iraq is the only country in the world that it has been continuously, and I mean continuously, every year being bombed for the last almost quarter of a century. The bombing of Iraq began in 1990, and it is still going on under various pretexts. But this is the only country that has been bombed every year for the last quarter of a century. There's no other country in the world that has gone through this. Accountability is clearly still not in sight. Iraq was a well-functioning country and a developed state with strong infrastructures and one of the finest education and health systems in the region. One can only recall the UN report, which was issued on the 20th of March, 1991, in which the Assistant Secretary General of the UN at that time, Mr. Martti Ahtisaari, who subsequently became the President of Finland, he wrote, and I quote, "Nothing has prepared us for the devastation that brought near apocalyptic results that reduced a highly urbanized and mechanized society and now relegated to near pre-industrial age." This is a UN report which was following a specific visit which was made by this team. This is a testimony of how the UN has flagrantly violated Article 2 of the UN Charter, and it has violated the 1949 Geneva Convention and the 1977 protocols. The US, the UK, and the so-called coalition of the willing perpetrated what was called shock and awe, which the previous Secretary General, Kofi Annan, described it after the events, after he has left, as illegal war. The war on Iraq is a war of aggression, despite the view of the English court's recent case, where they said that the war of aggression is not part of the English legal system, which is absolute rubbish, because Britain was party to the Nuremberg trial, and they applied that rule. The ICC itself defines the acts of aggression as international crimes. I will try in a short time that is available to look at the results that President Bush and Prime Minister Tony Blair of Iraq of Britain, have promised their people, that's the US citizens and the British public, they promised the UN, they promised the Europeans that Iraq will be, and I quote, beacon of democracy in the Middle East, that it is going to be an example of law and order in that region, and that it is going to be a stabilizing force for peace in the Middle East. This is what they have promised. In order to try and evaluate what's happening now, I have to make some reference to pre-2003. And there are two eras one can look at. One pre-1990, and the second one is between 1990, that's when sanctions were imposed on Iraq, until 2003. But even when I look at this, even when I look at the period when Iraq was under blockade, one will understand or will fail to understand how could Miss Madeleine Albright, the permanent secretary of the USA at her time in the UN, she thought that the death of 250,000 babies was a price worth paying to get rid of Saddam Hussein. We're not talking about a dictatorship. We're talking about the main country in the world, the USA. Now, I will try and address some of the issues on the human rights. There are always human rights abuses in Iraq and elsewhere. But over the last 15 years, after the occupation, I suggest to you that every human rights of every Iraqi is abused all of the time. Sometimes there are some human rights of some people at some times. In Iraq, all of human rights of all the people are abused all of the time. Now, the Human Rights Council would be well advised to take Iraq as the model when it looks at items 3, 4, and 9 of its annual agenda. On its annual agenda, it has 11 items, 10 items. 3, 4, and 9, Iraq fits the bill perfectly. They can take Iraq, and they can take any of the issues under these. So if I look at, for instance, unlawful detention, there are documents of the US forces, and there are UN documents, many that shows that there are many secret prisons in Iraq. And these, some of them, are supported by video evidence. And one example of that is one of the ex-prime presidents or prime minister in Iraq, Dr. Tariq al-Hashimi. He actually showed a video himself when he went to one of these prisons. The next one can look at the unlawful killing. This is another item which is on the UN agenda. There are more than 10,000 Iraqis killed and their bodies found in the streets. Not a single one of them was investigated or any single person was arrested. The unlawful killing takes place by a variety of ways. You have officially looking cars with official dress. You don't know who they are. They may be in the armed forces, in the police, or in the militias. They come around, go into a house under the pretext of fighting terrorism, and they shoot people there because they are trying to take one. That includes even some of the members of parliament. They've shot one of the members. They went to arrest one of their members of parliament because he was a, quote, a terrorist. They killed 2 of his brothers in there. If I look at the torture as another item, the Human Rights Council here, and even the timid UNAMI, there is a mission which is specially made for Iraq, but it is so timid, it just gives the Iraqi government point of view and claim this is a United Nations view. They have yet to criticize, over the last 2 or 3 reports they have produced, they are yet to criticize anything of substance. They make these general statements that the human rights situation in Iraq needs to be addressed, that rights of people are not being looked after, that the process, the political process is having problems. But there are no other issues. Even the secretary who is in charge of it, he is propagating the next election now. Now, I move from that to the torture. The Human Rights Council itself and UNAMI have stated so many times that and they have called on the Iraqi government in Baghdad to address this abuse. Human rights organizations, both Iraqi and international, you know, the Human Rights Watch and the International Amnesty International have listed a lot of these things. Death penalty, which is another item on the Human Rights Council agenda. Death penalty. Iraq has the highest, underlined, the highest per capita hanging in the world. If you take the population of Iraq and the number of death penalties there, it is exceeded by China, and number 2 is Iran, and number 3 is Iraq in terms of numbers. But Iraq, proportionately, is killing more people than Iran and China. Violation of children and women's rights. Iraq had a government which is a government which is a religious one, and it is permitting young girls of the age of 9 to be married. And they have legalized prostitution in Iraq in the form of mut'a marriage, which is translated into enjoyment marriage, whereby a man can actually have a formal contract with a woman in which it is limited to a period of time, an hour, 2 hours, 2 days, 3 days, against payment of money. This is part of the structure that the religious leaders in Iraq now are introducing. If we look at racism, which is another item on the agenda, the racism in Iraq is now endemic. There is divisions on sectarian grounds between Shiites and Sunnis who are Muslims. There is discrimination on religious basis between Muslims and Christians. And there is discrimination on ethnicity between the Kurds and the Arabs and the others, like Yazidis and what have you. Today in Iraq, and this is the degree of discrimination and racism now, if your name is Umar, and for those who are not Muslims, it indicates you are a Sunni, you cannot actually feel safe going through any checkpoint of anything, whether you're through the police or the militias or a checkpoint on the street or going to the airport, because Umar indicates you are a Sunni. And Sunnis have to be persecuted. Now, there is the issue of freedom of thought. Freedom of thought, irrespective of what people think of the Ba'ath political views. The Ba'ath movement, which is in the Arabic standard, it is the nationalist Arab movement. It's a pan-Arab nationalist movement. It ruled Iraq, and it is still ruling in Syria. But in fact, it is a nationalist political view. There are criminals, just like anywhere else. We have clergies who are criminals. We have religious leaders, imams who are criminals. We have leaders from political parties. I live in Britain, and we have quite a few politicians. I think we need to send them to prison, but that's a different issue. The ideology that people hold should never, ever be a reason for persecuting people. If you commit a crime, that's fine. If you don't, then you should not be treated this way. The United Nations and the Human Rights Council have failed, and they still fail, in accepting the idea that in Iraq today there is a government official office, which is called the Department of the National Supreme Commission for the Uprooting of Al-Ba'ath. And this is a department in the government that is designed to disqualify people from everything. That department, about, I think, a month ago or maybe less, they've issued a list of confiscating the assets and properties of something like 5,000 Iraqis. Among those people whose assets have been classified, taken away, is a person, his name is Fadl al-Shagra. He's from Mosul. This man was hanged in Iraq by Abdul Karim Qasim in 1959. So he has nothing to do with anything. But because at that time, he was against the communists. And at that time, Karim Qasim, who was a Shia, incidentally, so his children now, and his wife, or grandchildren, whoever, they've lost their assets. Demonstrations are not permitted in Iraq. Journalists are being killed in Iraq more than anywhere else in the world. And if I'm wrong, then probably just as many as they are everywhere else. There is a more important human rights, which I haven't talked about, and that is the right to life. The right to life is, in my view, is the basic one. All the other things are important, and they are all human rights. But first of all, I have to stay alive to have the right. Governments are there to secure the right of life to people. Mothers in Iraq, they don't know if their children, if their daughters are going to be killed by a bomb, or they will just disappear, or they will be killed by the militias, or they will be killed by the government. There is a law which is in Iraq, which is called the anti-terrorist law, anti-terrorism law, number 30 of 2005. This one provides for people to be sentenced to death, and it's a mandatory sentence if they are accused of being terrorists. But the definition of terrorism, and the American Bar Association has criticized it and some of the others, but not the UN. It is so widely drafted. I promise you, and I'm honest about that one, every single one of you could fall under that law, under Article 4 of it. There are people who are being sentenced to death by what is called the secret witness. In Iraq, under the judiciary now, people can come and give evidence that I've been seen talking to a terrorist, therefore I am a terrorist, and I don't need to know who the person is or they are, etc. Other human rights, generally speaking, the International Convention on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, it actually provides that, and I quote, it recognizes the right of everybody, everyone, to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. The Convention recognizes that states cannot do all that, but it says there is a duty on governments to ensure an equitable distribution of world food supplies in the relation to need. Iraq's population now, quarter of the population of Iraq are internally displaced. They are living in tents. No one knows their identities. No one knows their details. Yet the government, supported by UNAMI, are calling for an election because there is this myth which we are being peddling in Iraq that election means democracy, and election is not democracy. It's one of the means of getting to democracy. Democracy is when the government is answerable to the people. Now, I will go on 2-3 issues relating to the situation in Iraq. If I look, for instance, at the judiciary in Iraq. In 2003, Ambassador Bremer, the Viceroy of Iraq, issued Order Number 15 of 22nd June 2003. It's a 3-page document. In that one, he summarily dismissed 50% of all the Iraqi judges. The Iraqi courts, before the occupation, the delay in cases was something like 2 years lead time because of lack of judges. Bremer dismissed 50% of the judges summarily. So there was such a vacuum that, first of all, the Americans, they collected few ex-judges who have been dismissed from service for abuse of ability. They put them back because they became victims of Saddam Hussein, which is fine. Those are only few people. But you need judges. So they went and collected hundreds of Iraqi law graduates who have no experience. And they've given them a few months training, and they made them into judges. There were some lawyers who have never in their life done anything to do, I mean, lawyers, graduate of law college, but they were businessmen or they were people with lands and what have you. So this is the situation on the judiciary. The judiciary in Iraq at the present moment, if you don't have, if an Iraqi, ordinary Iraqi does not have a problem with the powerful, whatever the powerful is, he can buy a judgment. He can go to the judge and give him sufficient money and he will get the judgment in his favor. But if the opponent is a powerful one, either the government or the militia or one of the wealthy people or influential people, then he is 100% certain he will lose the case. This is why the judiciary in Iraq has been discredited to this degree. I'll go quickly to the government of Iraq. Following a secular regime in Iraq, it was not democratic of Saddam Hussein's regime. But now we have a theocratic dictatorship. The theocratic dictatorship with an unprecedented level of corruption. Iraq is classified at the bottom of the list of Transparency International. But just to make things look very nice, and me being British, I tell my British friends that Her Majesty the Queen has more influence on Iraqi government than she has on the British government. Because the president of Iraq is a British citizen. The prime minister of Iraq is a British citizen. The deputy prime minister is a British citizen. The vice president is a British citizen. 6 of the ministers are British citizens. Almost 20 members of parliament are citizens of Britain. And in Britain, Her Majesty has no influence on the government because she is a sovereign. She doesn't have anything to do with government. So she has more influence on the Iraqi government than the British one. If we look at the parliament now, the legislature. The parliament in Iraq, they have people divided according to Shias and Sunnis and Kurds and what have you. That's the division because this is the constitution which was given by the Americans. No, Fieldman drafted this one. Every member of the Iraqi parliament receives $25,000 US a month. And according to the one of the Daily Telegraph, the English Daily Telegraph, it said, this is a quote, this is a headline, it says, Iraq lawmakers are being paid over £180,000 a year for working for only 20 minutes since they were elected in March and without passing a single law. Now, some of the members of parliament, of the Iraqi parliament who were in opposition, and they were refugees in Europe, they, believe it or not, they continued to receive benefits from some of the countries until about 2 years ago. We have members of parliament who were getting benefits from the United Kingdom, from Sweden, from Denmark, from Holland. That is until about 2 years ago. Probably some of them still do. Health. Not a single hospital was built over the last 15 years in Iraq. Education. There is a flurry of universities in Iraq. There are now probably more than 100 universities in Iraq, but they are all commercial universities. They have nothing to do whatsoever with the education. It's a business entity, and the people who run them are businessmen, and they have nothing to do with the education. The country is controlled by militias because every country, its army is a national. They have a national identity. All armies everywhere in the world, except in Iraq. In Iraq, the belief or the do forgive me. In Iraq, the army belongs to the sect or the region or to an influential person. So they are either with Maliki or the Badi or Al-Amiri or somebody else. You have militias, Kurdish militias, you have Mosul militias, you have various militias in Iraq. Now, I don't want to take more time, but I would like just to say something. When we look 15 years and we compare it to what it was before the 2003, there was no Qaeda and there was no ISIS in Iraq. There were no internally displaced people. More than 5,000 doctors and academics have been killed. The infrastructure of Iraq, water, electricity, sewage system, do not exist. Education, health, do not exist. Iraq is at the bottom of Transparency International. Now, if one does any objective testing, any item with any item, no wonder this guy says that he wishes Saddam Hussein is back. Now, just before I finish, the center here, Geneva Center, on the 15th anniversary of Iraq, it's issuing, it's publishing a document which is called the 15th Anniversary of Invasion of Iraq. It will be published shortly. CICJ also will launch a website dedicated to the war on Iraq. The name of the website is www.iraqwar.gicj.org. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving me time.
Thank you very much for your presentation, although, sorry as well, also very brilliant presentation, but also very disturbing. You speak about the destruction following the 2003 illegal invasion on Iraq, and you describe to what extent this destruction has taken place on all levels. We shall not forget that before 2003, Iraq was the most advanced country in the Middle East. People from around the countries came to Iraq to work. We had women's rights. We had a functioning health system. And after 2003, everything was destroyed. You spoke about the judicial system that was dismantled under Bremer and the consequences and the impact on the right to life. And we shall all not forget, and of course that all this leads to sectarianism. Injustice, as we face it in Iraq and we observe it, nature leads to an escalation and extremism. So it is very, very important to call for accountability for the damage done to this country. And that's where I would like to introduce our last speaker, who is rightly talking about this issue, about accountability. Inde Komar is an American lawyer and the executive director of Just Atonement, which is a legal nonprofit organization dedicated to building peace and environmental sustainability. And he's an expert on international and US law and as it relates to crimes of aggression. So he represented Sundu Saleh in the case Sundu Saleh versus George Bush. It's an honor to have you here with us, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Democracy is dying. As we convene to remember the 15th year anniversary of the Iraq War, the fundamental lesson of that war is that our democratic norms are at grave risk when judges and courts fail to hold government leaders accountable for a patently illegal war. It is impossible to understand the lack of accountability over the Iraq War without understanding the defining crisis of our time. And that is the crisis of empire, of a disintegrating global order where the rule of law is now replaced with the rule of might. Aggression is the supreme international crime, a crime that was banned at Nuremberg, a crime which sent Nazi leaders to the gallows. The prohibition against aggression is a jus cogens norm of international law, meaning a norm from which no derogation is permitted and which states are obligated to uphold. There is overwhelming legal consensus that the United States and the United Kingdom committed the crime of aggression when they launched their invasion of Iraq in 2003. UN Secretary General Kofi Annan concluded that the war was illegal in 2004 and in contravention of the United Nations Charter. The Charter only allows acts of violence against another state in two circumstances. The first is in times of self-defense. The second is with explicit approval from the Security Council. Neither circumstance applied to the Iraq War. There was no Security Council resolution that authorized the war, and language in Resolution 1441, passed in November 2002, threatening Iraq with, quote, serious consequences, unquote, for failure to disarm was not enough. The US and the UK knew they needed a second resolution. This is plainly evidenced by their frantic attempts to obtain one prior to the war. That effort was abandoned when it became clear that other countries would not support a second resolution and that the second resolution would be vetoed. The US and the UK invaded Iraq anyway. Where would we be if all states acted like this? Where would we be, and what would be the purpose of the resolution process? What would be the purpose of the United Nations? It is also clear that the war was not conducted in self-defense. Self-defense is generally an immediate action against an imminent aggression. Iraq, which had been subject to more than a decade of crippling sanctions, was not in a position to invade the strongest country on earth. Iraq had no connection to al-Qaeda and had disarmed its weapons program. Two truths the Bush administration did not want the world to know or believe, and which they tried to cover up as they pushed for war. In the 15 years since the US-led invasion, there has only been one serious attempt to hold responsible leaders accountable for this supreme international crime. In the United States, private Iraqi civilians who were affected by the war tried to hold Bush-era officials accountable in the United States courts under a theory of aggression. However, in 2017, a court of appeals ruled in that case, the Saleh v. Bush case, that former President Bush and other former high officials had immunity from a civil investigation or inquiry into that lawsuit. The appellate court relied upon a domestic United States law that gives immunity to U.S. officials for alleged crimes committed in office, including heinous international crimes. This shows that today, in the United States, international legal obligations are inferior to the protection of government leaders, even when those leaders have committed grave offenses against others. The coalition also committed numerous other war crimes, which I will just talk about briefly during the Iraq War. First, the member states directed attacks against civilians who were not taking part in hostilities, a direct breach of the Geneva Conventions. In addition, human rights organizations, news agencies, and official military inquiries found that U.S.-operated facilities were using torture. For example, the torture at Abu Ghraib prison included physical abuse, like punching and slapping, as well as documented sexual abuse and rape at the prison. These acts of torture are grave breaches under the Geneva Conventions. They are war crimes, and they should be addressed as such. The United States has never prosecuted any high-ranking government officials for these war crimes, including torture. And in light of the 2017 judgment in the Saleh v. Bush case, there is virtually no chance that a civil inquiry will produce restitution for victims or change anyone's behavior in high office. In fact, just this week, the woman who helped oversee the Bush-era torture program has been rewarded for her complicity and is now the nominee to run the Central Intelligence Agency. A world in which government officials are immune from judicial scrutiny is a world of despotism and of tyranny. The essence of the rule of law is that no one is above the law, and that the actions of all people, including chief executives, can be scrutinized by a judge. Today, the rule of law everywhere is in grave danger, and we are dangerously close to living in a world where imperial norms are ascendant, even in Western countries. 15 years after the invasion of Iraq, what chills me the most has been the rapid acceptance and glorification of empire in the United States. In matters of foreign policy and increasingly in matters of domestic policy, the American president is totally unaccountable, immune from inquiry, and hostile to inalienable freedoms. Today, President Trump claims the authority and power to invade any country at will or destroy it completely with nuclear weapons, to assassinate any person with a robotic drone, to gather and collect any and all electronic communications, to hold any suspected terrorist indefinitely without trial in Guantanamo Bay, and to disregard pre-existing laws, constitutional rights, or judicial review. The powers of the American president today are greater than that of any English king or any Roman emperor. And like the ancient Romans, who were fed a steady diet of bread and circus, modern Americans are subject to some of the most pernicious forms of propaganda ever developed. Concentrated media power has resulted in corporate news programming which demonizes Muslims, foreigners, and people of color. Meanwhile, concentrated economic power has resulted in the greatest systemic inequality of wealth in American history. This has led to concentrated political power, which has resulted in a neo-fascist and openly racist Republican Party and a neoliberal and systemically racist Democratic Party. More than ever, Americans accept the slaughter of people in the Middle East in the name of their security. In Bagram, Guantanamo, and elsewhere, people are indefinitely detained without trial and are subjected to torture. Imperial garrisons encircle our planet with more than 800 American military bases in 80 countries on every major continent, from Diego Garcia to Okinawa, to Ramstein, to Samoa, to the Azores. Just in the last month, the American government announced its plans to develop a new class of nuclear weapons, furthering an arms race with the Russians, the Chinese, and the North Koreans. Not since Rome has the world borne witness to so few controlling so many. But these violent delights have violent ends, and American society, my society, is ever more crippled by moral, ethical, and humanitarian crises that routinely shock visitors from other countries. Students drown in student debt, unable to start their careers. There's a complete lack of affordable health care and an addiction crisis which is dragging American life expectancy downward. America's obsession with war has turned inward as a gun violence crisis results in the weekly sacrifice of children to the cult of the Second Amendment. And de facto apartheid keeps power in the hands of a privileged white elite who have destroyed labor unions, created enemies out of Muslims and blacks, have crippled millions of people into lives of debt servitude and destitution, and who buy and sell their favored elected officials by caprice and whim. The country that produced the Iraq War 15 years ago is in far worse shape today and is possible and can produce far greater atrocities today than it might have done 15 years ago. There are three important reasons why we need to urgently create accountability for the Iraq War. First, we must restore an international order based on the rule of law. Second, we must confront the bias of international law, holding only poor and non-Western countries liable for international crimes while ignoring the crimes of Western powers. This bias is underscored and exacerbated if the international community declines to investigate and prosecute the coalition's crimes in Iraq. And of course, finally, we must provide justice to the victims of the Iraq War. The United Nations was manipulated as a tool to acquire wider support for the invasion, most prominently U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell's 2003 speech falsely claiming facts about the Iraqi weapons program. In so doing, the United States abused this body, the United Nations, turning these halls into a house of lies, lies spread to support the annihilation of another member state. This abuse of the United Nations to further a perverse agenda, an agenda that stands in direct contradiction of the purpose of the United Nations, makes it essential to restore accountability. Without accountability, we invite future abuse of this precious international system, and we exacerbate the divisions in our world where non-Western crimes are treated with far greater scrutiny than those committed by Western powers. A just world order depends on consistent accountability for all nations, for war crimes and for the crime of aggression. International law needs to be applied equally to all nations. Without accountability, we leave Iraqi victims to fend for themselves. We fail them as lawyers, as delegates, and as ethical beings. There is a choice facing our species at this very moment. Humor me when I tell you that I have glimpsed our future, and it is a future that I believe to be very dark. I foresee a world beset by environmental problems, with numerous species going extinct, with garbage and plastic choking our waterways and our forests, and with climate change creating global chaos for which our world is simply not prepared. I foresee displacement and refugee crises as people flee their homes in the wake of rising seas, making more powerful storms, and historic heat waves and droughts. People movements that will make the Syrian crisis seem like a child's game. I foresee a world where people, devastated by economic despair, turn to demagogues and authoritarians, as they are already doing, as ways of dealing with the desiccation of their ways of life. I foresee a world where our democratic freedoms, already withering, are replaced with stark imperial values. But this does not have to be our future. There is another way, and that way begins here, today, with each of us. It begins with imagining a world where the rule of law and democracy are the fundamental building blocks of our shared human rights, our shared freedoms, and our shared civilization. It begins with us realizing that we deserve to live in a better world than one in which leaders who commit grave international crimes can walk free, while the victims of those outrageous acts are forced to recover in the solitude and pain of trauma. There is a choice we face, a choice between civilization and chaos. The Iraq War was the gravest international crime since the Second World War. It was a malicious act committed by leaders of the most powerful country in history, with the full resources of a multi-trillion-dollar economy. We cannot build a civilized future for ourselves and for our descendants unless we build a robust international legal order. The people who commandeered my country and my government must be held to account before a judge so that they know and others know that the supreme crime cannot go unpunished. Help me build that future. Help me in our quest for a civilized earth. I call today for the creation of an independent international legal tribunal with jurisdiction to investigate and indict the British and American leaders who led the invasion for the crime of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. I call for this tribunal to analyze impartially, once and for all, the issue of immunity as it relates to grave international crimes. I call for due process for the accused, that they be advised of the charges against them and be given access to counsel so that they may mount a defense. If convicted, I call for them to serve out their sentences in humane conditions where they can reflect on what they have done. I call on the tribunal to order restitution to the millions of victims who suffered on account of their conduct. I call for every nation concerned with justice to open their courts to claims of aggression on the basis of universal jurisdiction. Those who commit aggression, like those who commit torture, slavery, and piracy, are hostis humani generis, enemies of humanity, who may be prosecuted and held to account in the court of any civilized country. The hope of our shared civilization rests on a renewed commitment to the United Nations and its vision of collective security. Thus, I urge the Human Rights Council to appoint a special rapporteur for the human rights situation in Iraq. I urge the United Nations to condemn illegal acts of aggression, torture, and mass killings, including those committed by powerful countries like the United States. And I ask my countrymen and women in America to walk back from the abyss of empire. We have a special duty to hold our leaders responsible, to make redress to the Iraqi people, and to promote and sustain the global peace. This is the way back to civilization itself, towards a deep and fulfilling justice that enables all of us to live out our lives in dignity and in peace. This is a future worth imagining, and it is a future worth creating. It starts with justice for the Iraq War. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for this presentation. And there is not much one can say. You really described the extent of the crimes on a legal level. And you also warned about the consequences of impunity. You described to what extent, if there is impunity, this is undermining the very foundation of the United Nations and has an impact on our future. If there is no accountability for war crimes, and if there are countries that can invade others with impunity, where does this lead if there is no consequences of this? Thank you also for giving us a perspective, a positive perspective, and an idea how to restore the credibility of the United Nations and accountability. So we've had several speakers now who from the beginning of the invasion until the very end and to the question of accountability have covered many, many issues. We don't have much time left. There are only 3 minutes left, so I don't think there is much room for question and answers. Nevertheless, I would still like to remind you of the website that will soon be published by Geneva International Centre for Justice.
I think it is a panel discussion. I think it is a panel discussion, and
I'm sorry, I don't see you, and I didn't give you the floor. Just to
I think it is panel discussion, and in the base of transparency, is to give the it is fair to give the representative of the Iraqi government to talk for a few minutes, or because I have some questions.
Sorry, I am the moderator here.
Yeah, but
so I'm the one to give you the floor.
You didn't give any time. It is not.
We unfortunately we have some time constraints, and we only have
but it is as mentioned. It is a panel discussion.
I kindly ask you, of course, but unfortunately we have only 2 minutes left. So you are very welcome to come here to talk to our panelists and also to discuss this in a constructive manner. I apologize.
No, it is not kind of transparency here.
The timely restraint.
You just listen to one side, and this is not fair. Thank you.
Of Iraq, of the Iraqi government. Okay, no, we apologize for the time constraint, but we are very thankful, of course, for all who come back to talk to us in a constructive manner, as it's the spirit of the United Nations. Once again, I would like to remind you that there will be soon be the website of Geneva International Centre for Justice, which is dedicated to the war in Iraq. And well, at the end of this panel, I would like to thank our panelists for their very valuable contributions. I would also like to thank the interpreters for their hard work. 2 hours interpretation is very, very hard. I know that. I'm translator myself, so thank you very much. Thank you to Al Jazeera also for broadcasting this event. Thanks to all of you for having been here, and wish you all the best. Thank you.